Now, in the last lesson, we learned how to add our add item to cart mutation to our collection item. We're now able to populate our cart dropdown, which is listening to our cart item's local state on our Apollo client. But we need to also display the total quantity of items in our cart inside of our cart icon. Now, you might already have an inkling of how to do this, but how do you actually attach it so you make sure that every time we add an item, this count is also increasing? Well, unlike Redux, we don't have selectors that will depend on these other values so that whenever they update, our values also update. That's a very Redux-like pattern. Instead, what we have to do is we have to make sure to write it inside of our mutation itself. That is doing the actual modification to the cart. So let me show you. Inside of our client.write data, we're going to make a new variable here called cart, or let's just call it item count. And this by default will be 0. Now, the item count is going to literally be the count of the total items. And for us, we just have to make sure that we update it whenever we add, clear, or remove items, right? We've got to make sure that we always recompute this value. Now, how we're going to do this is we are going to modify our resolver add item to cart code so that it knows to do that. And this is actually very easy. It sounds more complicated than it is. All we have to do is we have to first bring in the code that actually calculates quantity from our selector. So inside of our cart selector, we had our select cart items count. We just have to copy this over. And what we'll do is we'll move it into our cart utils. So here we'll make a new function called get cart quantity, or get cart item count. And this is going to get the cart items as the argument, and it's just going to return an integer. So now we're just going to copy this over into our resolvers. And then we're also going to add in this value as a query. So we're going to say const get item count is equal to GQL. And as you expect, it's just going to get the item count from the client. Let me just make sure I didn't accidentally. Yep, no, we're fine. I thought I accidentally capitalized the I. So now that we have our item count, what we're going to do is we are just going to make sure that we pluck it off inside of our add to cart as well. So here what we'll say is that we want to also read down or set the value, right? We don't need to read it inside of the add item to cart. We just want to make sure that we set it every time the item gets increased. So what we'll do is we will write in this new function where we say cache.write query, where what we pass to it is our query for get item count. And then the data that we're going to set is equal to this object where item count goes to get cart item count, and then we're going to pass in our new cart items. And now what happens is that whenever the item gets added to the cart, so whenever this mutation fires, it will also make sure to update our item count query. That's all this is doing. So now we're writing two different queries inside of one mutation. Let's just make sure to pull that query into our cart icon. So inside of our cart icon container, we're already using the mutation. We just also need to use the query to pull that item count into our cart item component. So here we'll say const get item count is equal to GQL with this object of item count off the client. And just like we did before, We just have to make sure to wrap our mutation inside of our query, where the query goes to get item count. And then we also have to make sure that inside of our mutation, we are properly wrapping this whole thing so that when we get back our data from this function, right? Sorry, from this query as a function, we can say that the data gives us the item count, which we then want to pass into our cart icon as item count. And now let's just make sure that in our cart icon, that's actually the property that it's expecting, which is item count. So now we can actually remove its connection to state here, remove our map state to props, and remove all of these selectors. And now, if we go back to our app, we'll see that the number is updating as expected. And that's pretty much the majority of the kind of mutations that we're going to write. Now, there is one last thing I want to show you. So what I'm going to show you is actually a way where you can use the higher order component pattern to compose out this container in a way that looks way more similar to the connect function that we're used to using with React Redux. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to pull in the compose function and the GraphQL function. So these are actually two functions that we can use in place of the query and the mutation components that we just explored in all these last few lessons. Now, this pattern is going to look way closer to what we're used to with React Redux because we're able to pass in the query and mutation values that we get from these functions in as props instead. So let me show you how we'll do that. So let's first get rid of these query and these mutation components inside of our code. And what we're going to do is we are going to call compose in the very similar way as how we called connect. Now we're going to pass our cart icon container to the return of this compose, which will of course be a function that will group in all of these queries and mutations that we're trying to add to our cart icon. And in order to do that, we have to use this GraphQL function that we just imported. Now, I'm going to post for you the docs for this GraphQL function. There's a lot you can do with it, but the main thing that it does is it takes mutations and queries and it binds them to some component that we can pass as the outcome of that function, because it is a higher order component function. And as we've already explored with them, they're pretty much just functions that take components and then amplify them with some additional behavior. In this case, the additional behavior is the props and access to either query properties or mutation properties. So what we need to do in order to use it is we simply call GraphQL and we pass it either a mutation or a query. So let's first pass in our get item count. With that, we'll now have access to our data object inside of the props that this container gets. And that data will have our item count property, the same way that we saw whenever we wrote our query function inside of our query component. Now, the interesting thing about this GraphQL toggle cart hidden value, though, is when we pass in toggle cart hidden, it will actually give us that mutation as a prop. The only thing is that mutation by default is not called whatever the actual mutation's name is that we're plucking from this GQL query string. Instead, it's going to call it mutate. Now, we don't want that. We want it to be named after something that we expect it to do, right? We expect it to toggle cart hidden. So in order for us to do that, we can actually pass in a configuration object as the second argument to this GraphQL function. Now, this second argument can take a number of different configuration options, which you'll find in the documentation that I've linked in your resources. But the main one that we want to access is name. And for name, we're just going to say toggle cart hidden. That's all it is. right? It's a property called name, and it expects a string, which it will then set as the actual name of the prop that gets passed in for this mutation. We can do the same thing here for GraphQL of our getItemCount as well. If, say, we wanted this mutation name not to be called, if we wanted this query to not be called data, and we wanted it to be called item count data, we could do that as well. Especially when we start using multiple queries and multiple mutations, we're going to want to use this name object property, right, as this configuration, because then we'll be able to pluck the values off of all of these different props that are going to be passed into our props of our component. With this, what we'll see is actually the props. So I'm actually going to show you what this props object looks like first before we start destructuring off the values that we need. So let's just get rid of this because it will break otherwise. Let's save this, go back to our app, and here we see we get both this data object as well as our toggle cart hidden mutation as a function. Now, this data object is large and you probably won't see, oh, there it is actually. You do see the item count. So there you see the data, right? It has all these other things that we can do with it if we wanted to trigger other actions that are actually way more verbose than we need. But we see the item count. So all we want to do is we want to pluck off the item count from our data. And we also want to pluck off our toggle cart hidden. So with this, we are now accessing both our toggle cart hidden mutation as well as our item count. If we save this and we go back, we see that our application still works as it did before. Our cart icon behaves the way that we expect it to. It toggles cart hidden with that mutation, and it has the item count as the actual query value. So this pattern is probably way more familiar to you as far as how it looks with React Redux. Now, I will mention that the Apollo team seems to be pushing harder for using the query and the mutation components that we did earlier. But honestly, I think this pattern is perfectly fine. High order components is a pattern that has been around in the React ecosystem for a really long time, and it's really well fleshed out, especially with Redux. But again, it's really up to you, whatever you prefer. Component method is way more similar to the context API style of adding in components and nesting your component tree appropriately. And this compose pattern is just the higher order component pattern. Personally, I do prefer this compose pattern because it looks closer to what I'm used to working with, but you can use either or. If you have components that only need the one query or the one mutation component, feel free to use that. It's only when you start needing to nest multiple mutations and multiple queries that it's obvious that the compose pattern is way better and simpler to use. Now, you might be wondering, should I instead move this compose into cart icon? Because this container is literally just almost like another layer here that just plucks this data and we're just passing this in. Well, you can, but personally, I prefer still keeping this container because this container layer is the one that destructures off the item count as well as the toggle cart hidden and then passes it into toggle cart hidden. This allows my cart icon component to be a presentational component, whereas the container layers are the ones that actually care about what to do with the cart icon and how it ends up actually getting the data. This way, if I needed this cart icon in multiple places that might rely on multiple different queries in order to get their item count, I don't know, it's a possibility. My cart icon does not have to care about how that data comes in. It simply cares about when it finally gets the item count value. So this container style you can even do in your React Redux code too. Instead of putting compose inside of our components as we did, we can make new container files. But it does increase more complexity and it increases the number of files. So there's always trade-offs. But hopefully now you're fully equipped with everything you need in order to convert the rest of the application over to using the Apollo client's local storage. So definitely give it a try. Rewatch these videos if you need to get a refresher on how everything works. Otherwise, I have included both a GitHub repo as to everything that we've done up until this point, as well as a GitHub repo that has the completed version of this application using solutions that I've come up with. So you can compare your solutions to mine. I'm not saying mine are necessarily the best, it's just how I would do them. Those are the trade-offs that I have decided to make. And in the next lesson, we'll wrap up this section on GraphQL and Apollo, and I'll leave you with some of my final thoughts.